Good day to you out there in podcast world. This is Tony Denton coming to you again from Phoenix, Arizona on this 25th day of September 2019. We are up to installment 34 now out of 37 in my audiobook of my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawed is Fulfilled. We're up to Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 through 29, the end of the chapter. If you have the book and you've been following along in my book, we're on page 273 as we begin today. Thank you for being here. So let's launch right into it. Following the outline in the introduction of my book, this section heads toward the conclusion of Paul's thoughts concerning Christ's superior principle of faith, chapter 10, verse 19, through chapter 13, verse 25. More specifically, chapter 12, 22 through 29 wrap up Paul's thoughts concerning how that this principle establishes a relationship superior to that which was possible under Moses. This implies, of course, that since God spent thousands of years orchestrating everything in order to get to this point, chapter 1, verse 2 and chapter 11, verse 3, then it would be foolish of him to accept any type of previously permitted relationship. That is, any relationship which dodges Jesus. For example, returning to the old law. So in this section, Paul wrote his sixth and last warning of the book. He warned against rejecting God's Christ and the kingdom he was in the process of bringing to fruition. Why? Because only through Jesus and this kingdom could they, and we of course, have total forgiveness, redemption, and a once-for-all restored relationship or fellowship to their and our Creator, a relationship in which man can serve him acceptably. So, let's begin with verse 22 of Hebrews chapter 12. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. After writing in the previous verses about the awesomeness exhibited in the giving of the law of Moses, Paul began to contrast something even greater than that. And that which is greater is that of which they as Christians had become part, 1 Peter 2 verse 5. In other words, in harmony with Ephesians 1 verse 10, a verse that I've mentioned a few times in this book because it's a perfect summary of the book of Hebrews, they were already part of that which was in the process of being expanded to include the earth. Verse 28 of this chapter later reads, we are receiving a kingdom which, unlike that of Moses, cannot be shaken. Not only is this present tense, but it also brings to mind a statement made in the very next chapter, a few verses later in chapter 13, verse 14, when Paul used the phrase, about to come, from the Greek word melo. So they were in a process, present tense, of receiving the kingdom. That kingdom could not be shaken, was not shaken, and has never been shaken. And it was about to come at the time Paul wrote. Well, what a wondrous thing to be part of that which is even greater than what their ancestors were involved in and experienced. These brethren were experiencing the giving of the law of Christ from Zion instead of the law of Moses from Sinai. Check out verse 18 and compare that with Galatians chapter 4 verses 22 through 26. The term Zion was actually another designation for earthly Jerusalem, sometimes called Mount Zion, since Jerusalem was situated on a hill, which is why the Bible sometimes speaks of going down to a place that was actually north of Jerusalem. Luke 10 verse 30, for an example. As discussed in chapter 9, God dwelled by the Ark of the Covenant, the only piece of furniture in the tabernacle's holiest of all. Thus, in a sense, where the ark was, God was. So, because King David placed the ark of the Lord in Jerusalem, 2 Samuel chapter 6 verses 12 and 17, it became known as the city of God, or where God dwelt. Psalm 46:4 and Psalm 132 verse 13, which in turn, of course, implies that when God destroyed it, he was finished dwelling there. Check out John 4:21. Since God would ultimately live in another Zion, the New Testament kingdom, the term Zion is used numerous times in prophecies to refer to that is, the New Testament kingdom, not the Old Covenant kingdom of national Israel. For examples, see Isaiah 1:27, Isaiah 28:16, Isaiah 33:5, and Isaiah 60 in verse 14. The phrase, the city of God here in verse 22, is the very city that their most beloved forefathers were looking forward to. Check out chapter 11, verse 16. It was an eternal spiritual kingdom, not a temporary physical one like that of David. 2 Samuel 5, verses 7 and 9. In other words, it was the heavenly Jerusalem, not the earthly one, that Abraham looked forward to. Chapter 11, verse 10. According to chapter 9, verse 8, the old law didn't make any provisions for men to enter into this wondrous city. The same wondrous city referenced in chapters 3 and chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation. Words penned to more suffering Christians of that generation. Check out Revelation 3 verse 12, Revelation 21 verse 1, and compare those with Matthew 24, 34 through 35, Matthew 21, 2 and 3, and verses 9 and 10. Listing the innumerable company of angels here seems to imply that, by becoming members of this heavenly city, they had become part of the kingdom which includes the angels of God. Again, reminiscent of Ephesians 1 verse 10, probably the best summary of biblical eschatology in the entire Bible. It says, in the dispensation of the fullness of the times, God would gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth. There's that heavens and earth business again. Check out my notes in Hebrews 1 verse 10. Following this statement in Ephesians, Paul went on to write that God has raised us up together and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ, Ephesians 2, verse 6. Verse 23 of Hebrews 12. To the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, check out Genesis 18:25, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. As indicated in other versions, such as the NIV, General Assembly actually refers to an assembly of celebration. Check out the English word panegyric, P-A-N-E-G-Y-R-I-C, the Greek word that's used here. And here it's actually directly connected to the angels of verse 22, meaning that verses 22b and 23a should read something more like this. You have come to a festive assembly of myriads, that's the Greek term, of angels. A festive assembly, a panegyric, if that's how it's pronounced. But what does that mean or imply? Number one, the angels, as part of God's kingdom to which Christians were being joined, rejoiced over salvation and those being saved. Check out Luke 15:10 and Luke 2 verses 13 through 15. And number two, the angels also rejoiced because they were seeing how all God's labor over the centuries was finally working itself out for this salvation. Check out 1 Peter 1:12 and Matthew 13:17. And number three, while there was terror exhibited in the giving of the law by angels via Moses, chapter 12 verse 18 and chapter 2 verse 2 of Hebrews, these first century brethren should have been sharing in the joy the angels were experiencing in the giving of the law of Christ by the Spirit via the apostles. The phrase, the church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, is reminiscent of Philippians 3 verse 20 and Philippians 4 verse 3, where Paul spoke of Christians as having their citizenship in heaven and in its book of life, even though they lived on earth. As a reminder, the church is that part of the kingdom which exists only on earth. Who are the firstborn here? Number one, as the complete clause clearly indicates, the firstborn here is not a reference to Christ as it was in chapter 1 verse 6, but it's a reference to Christians, because the Greek term here is plural in number. And number two, it isn't a reference to all Christians of all time, but to the first Christians, especially the Jews who submitted to Jesus as the promised Messiah before the Holocaust of AD 70, otherwise known as the remnant. In fact, I believe the firstborn here are parallel to the remnant of Revelation 14, 1 through 4. Note specifically John's terms, Mount Zion, and firstfruits there in that passage. So perhaps we today fit better into the numerous Christians of Romans 8:29, in which Paul spoke of Jesus as being the firstborn among many. By the way, I also believe there's a shadow-substance correlation between the firstborn of Hebrews 12 and the firstborn of Exodus chapter 12. You can consider that for yourself at some point. The phrase, God the judge of all, from Genesis 18:25, was placed here probably because he's the one who decided who was to be registered in heaven as a citizen and who was not to be so registered. When he wrote of the spirits of just men made perfect in this verse, Paul was probably thinking of all the faithful saints who had gone on before these brethren, perhaps with special reference to those he had just delineated in the previous chapter, that is, chapter 11. Verse 24, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. Whereas the old covenant was given through Moses as mediator, Galatians 3:19, the new, better covenant established upon better promises, Hebrews 8 verse 6, was given by God through his Son who mediates at his right hand, Hebrews 1 verse 3 and other passages. Next, Paul contrasted Jesus' blood with that of Abel. Check out chapter 11 verse 4. The question is, did Paul have in mind the blood of Abel's animal sacrifice or Abel's personal blood shed by his brother? If he had Abel's animal sacrifice in mind, Genesis 4, 1 through 4, then perhaps he was contrasting blood that could not forgive sins, Hebrews 10 verse 4, with blood that could, Hebrews 9, 14, and Hebrews 10, 22. But if he had Abel's personal blood in mind, Genesis 4, 10 and Genesis 4, 15, then perhaps he was contrasting the blood of the righteous who cried out for vengeance, Matthew 23, 29 through 39, especially verse 35, with the blood that was shed for forgiveness, Ephesians 1 verse 7. Either way, mercy and forgiveness are emphasized. Now, based on all of Paul's contrasts between the Old and New Covenants in verses 18 through 24 here in Hebrews 12, he went on in verses 25 through 29 to warn them against renouncing Christ and his kingdom. Verse 25, see then that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven. The term for refuse here means to disown or renounce, and the present tense term for see means to see to it on a continuous basis, translated as beware in chapter 3 verse 12. So, putting this together, Paul was essentially saying, you must see to it that you never even consider renouncing Christ. In other words, because of all that I have told you here in chapter 12, verses 18 through 24 especially, because of this, see to it that you never even consider renouncing Jesus. This is the opposite of what the Israelites did as indicated in verse 19. If one fails to read verse 26 with verse 25, he may struggle figuring out how Abel spoke on earth, since he seems to be the antecedent for the pronoun him in the next phrase, him who spoke on earth. Verse 26 makes it clear that Paul had returned to talking about God when he came down upon Mount Sinai to give the law through Moses. Exodus 19, 18 through chapter 20, verse 19, and Hebrews 12, verses 18 through 21. And that was in contrast to his speaking grace from Mount Zion through Jesus. See John 1:17, and then confer Hebrews 1, verse 1 with Hebrews 12, 22 and 24. What I'm saying is, I think the contrast is between God speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai as being contrasted to God speaking through Jesus and Mount Zion. Not that he was talking about Abel himself doing any speaking, whether literally or figuratively. Anyway, the warning of this verse is actually just a repeat of at least two others found in Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 2, 2 and 3, and chapter 10, 23 through 30. In fact, you could even look at Hebrews 2, 2, and 3 being the first warning, and now it is repeated at the end of the book in chapter 12. Anyway, it was a warning based on a logical conclusion. Since God did not let those who refused his previous inferior law escape punishment, Hebrews 3, 7 through chapter 4, verse 5, certainly he wouldn't let these brethren escape an even worse punishment for refusing his superior law of grace and liberty, one that cost him his only begotten Son. So let's read verse 26. Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. The part about God's voice shaking the earth refers once again, of course, to the time when God gave the law at Mount Sinai. Speaking of God descending upon Mount Sinai, Exodus 19:18 says that the whole mountain greatly quaked. The latter part of verse 26 here in Hebrews 12 is a quote from Haggai 2 verse 6. a prophecy that found its fulfillment when the old law was replaced by the new. That's the context in which Paul placed it here in Hebrews chapter 12. In fact, the entire book of Hebrews. And it also corresponds to Joel 3:16, the context of which speaks of the coming of the new covenant administration at the destruction of the old. Check out Joel chapters 2 and 3. Joel 3 verse 16 specifically says, "The Lord also will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem," just as we've been discussing. Check out Luke 24:47. "The heavens and earth will shake, but the Lord will be a shelter for his people." That is, his people won't be shaken. And by the way, Isaiah chapters 2 and 3 are parallel to Joel chapters 2 and 3. And in Isaiah 2:19 and 21, one can read about how God would shake the earth mightily at the time of the exchange of covenant administrations that was obviously fulfilled in the last generation of the Jews between Pentecost and Holocaust, AD 30 through AD 70. When studying Hebrews chapter 1 earlier, there was a lengthy discussion concerning the apocalyptic prophetic usage of the phrase heavens and earth, and how that it was often employed to refer to the demise of one administration for another. So check out my notes on Hebrews 1 verse 10. Also check out Isaiah 51 4 through 6 and 15 through 16, Isaiah 65 7 and 17, Isaiah 66 22. Also check out Matthew 5 17 and 18, Matthew 24 29, and Matthew 24 34 through 35, verses which can refer to nothing else but the time of AD 70, when this whole concept of heavens and earth came to a conclusion. That is, the Old Covenant heavens and earth. The New Covenant heavens and earth, of which Peter spoke in 2 Peter 3, that's a different matter that is dealt with in those passages I just mentioned. If I keep on, I'm going to get off on 2 Peter 3, which is a wonderful passage. So it isn't difficult for one to see that the literal shaking in Exodus became the basis for the Jews' figurative expression, the shaking of heavens and earth, which denotes a change in administration or law, that with which Paul had been dealing throughout the entirety of the book of Hebrews. Here's a side note before we get on to verse 27. I agree with Adam Clarke, who said that the prophetic writings often used this terminology. Earth to describe the land or city of Jerusalem, and heavens to describe its political and religious constitution. So in AD 70, when Jerusalem and its temple were annihilated, their heaven and earth, their world, was removed so that a new heaven and earth could be established. Check out Revelation 20 and 11 and Revelation 21 verse 1, as well as my study on my website, asightforthelord.com, on 2 Peter chapter 3. Alright, verse 27. Now this, yet once more, indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken, as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. Paul drew attention to the phrase, yet once more, here, because it implies something that's final, meaning that the new heavens and earth would be the last administration because it would be so perfect that there would never be a need for another. This verse provides another indication why Paul wasn't referring to the material heavens and earth. Whatever would be shaken and removed was in the process of being shaken at the time he wrote, nearly 2,000 years ago, corresponding to chapter 8 of Hebrews verse 13, where, speaking of the first covenant, he wrote that it was, at that time, becoming obsolete and growing old, ready to vanish away. Or, as he said in 2 Corinthians, it was in the process at that time, AD 53, of passing, present tense, passing away, chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. So, here's Hebrews in AD 63, speaking still in the present tense of it coming to a conclusion that it's happening, present tense, becoming obsolete, growing old, and as well, just like it began earlier, even more than 10 years ago in 2 Corinthians. It was passing away. The old covenant was in the process of passing away from the time Jesus died on the cross until he fulfilled every jot and tittle, every I, dot, and T cross at the time he returned and took Jerusalem out of existence as far as God was concerned. Check out Luke 21, verse 22. The phrase, things that are made, here in Hebrews 12, verse 27, or created, is obviously a reference to the physical, that which was temporary, as opposed to the spiritual, that which is eternal. In other words, all those physical things like Jerusalem, the specific city to which Jews had to come, and the temple, the specific part of Jerusalem to which the Jews had to come, would all be superseded by that which was and is spiritual and eternal. The things that were being shaken, that is, the old interim Jerusalem, etc., were on the verge, the Greek word melo, chapter 13, verse 14, of being supplanted with things. The word things here is used in this verse. The new covenant and its kingdom is what he's referring to. Those are the things which cannot and will never be shaken, much less supplanted, which is why the Messiah was talked about as being a king forever and ever, such as in Isaiah chapter 9 and in Luke chapter 1. In chapter 13, verse 14 of Hebrews, Paul said that in their present circumstances they had no continuing city, but they were seeking the one about to come. And what would that be but the city of God, the heavenly Jerusalem of chapter 12, verse 22. In chapter 9, verse 11, using some of the same language found in chapter 12, verse 27 and chapter 13, verse 14, Paul wrote, Christ came as high priest of the good things about to come, with a greater and more perfect tabernacle not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. So, that leaves us with verses 28 and 29, which we'll do together. Since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear, for our God is a consuming fire. The word grace could be translated as thankfulness, implying that only service rendered out of gratitude, as opposed to merit, especially via the old law, is acceptable now. Check the NIV, NASB, and Earl's word meanings in the New Testament. However, and perhaps better per this particular text, it should be translated gift, like 2 Corinthians 8 verse 4, with reference to the kingdom as the gift. The word have in the phrase, let us have grace, means to hold on to. It's translated as retain in Romans 1:28, and I have kept in Luke 19 verse 20. So Paul is admonishing them to continue on securing the gift they were in the process of receiving, for only through it could they truly serve God acceptably. Note carefully how the fulfillment of Daniel's chapters 2, 7, and 9 is also unmistakably evoked in this text. Especially check out Daniel chapter 7, verses 18 and 21 to 22. The word reverence refers to respect demonstrated by means of humility, and the phrase godly fear is from a single term, the same term used in relation to Jesus in chapter 5, verse 7, where it says that his prayers were heard because of his godly fear. Since we know Jesus didn't fear his Father in a sense of being scared or terrified of him, then this helps us to see that here it's simply a synonym for reverence or humble respect. The word for godly fear here is from deos, which refers to moving with caution, whereas phobos is the word that refers to the terror which seizes one when danger emerges. Verse 29 is a quote from Deuteronomy 4, verse 24, a verse found just before Moses repeated the law given in Exodus 20 and after God set fire to Mount Sinai by his presence, Exodus 19. According to Deuteronomy chapter 4, Moses warned the Jews against idolatry by reminding them of the fire of Mount Sinai. God is a consuming fire. And according to Deuteronomy 9 verse 3, Moses also let them know that God would be a consuming fire for them against their enemies. Check out chapter 10, 26 through 31. Thus, these brethren needed to choose if they wanted God to be for or against them. They needed to decide if they would side with their rejecting brethren and be consumed in judgment, or if they would side with believing brethren and be saved from condemnation. God isn't only a God of mercy, grace, and love, 1 John 4:8, but he's a God of justice as well. Okay, at this point we're going to move on to page 323 so I can read my translation of these verses. So, on page 323, we're going to read verses 22 through 29 of Hebrews 12 from my translation. But you've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, to the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriads of angels, to a festive gathering, to the assembly of firstborn ones who've been enrolled in the heavens, to God the judge of all, to the perfected spirits of righteous ones, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkling of his blood, which communicates a better message than that of Abel's blood. So see to it that you don't refuse him who's speaking once again. For since those who refused him who provided revelation on their own ground didn't escape, certainly we shouldn't expect to escape if we reject him who's speaking from the heavens. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. Now the expression, yet once more, indicates the removal of the things being shaken, those things previously established, in order that the things not being shaken may remain. So let's be receiving to ourselves the gift of the unshakable kingdom, through which we may, with propriety and fervent piety, render well-pleasing sacred service to God. For our God is indeed a consuming fire. All right, there you have it, the end of chapter 12 of Hebrews, with only 3 more audiobook sessions to go. Thank you so much for being with me. I look forward to sharing more with you next week as we approach and begin chapter 13 of Hebrews. Have a great week.